You told me to know my place, Officer Caldwell. Judge Isaiah Bennett's voice moved through the federal courtroom with a quiet force that made every chair, every paper, and every whisper seem to stop at once. On the polished oak bench before him rested the security credential Ryan Caldwell had worn with complete confidence less than 20 minutes earlier. Now Caldwell stood alone in the center aisle, no radio at his shoulder, no authority in his voice, and no one in the room willing to look away. The attorneys had turned from their tables. The court clerk sat perfectly still. Reporters watched with pens suspended over their notebooks. Even the old ceiling fans seemed to move more slowly beneath the weight of the silence. Bennett adjusted the sleeve of his black, judicial robe and looked down at the man who had tried to decide where he belonged. "This court is not interested in humiliation," he said. "It is interested in truth." Caldwell opened his mouth, but no words came. He had expected anger. He had expected revenge. What he faced instead was something far more difficult to dismiss, a complete record of his own choices. Bennett placed one hand beside the credential. "You believe this badge allowed you to define another man's place," he continued. "Now this courtroom will examine how you used yours." No one spoke. No one defended Caldwell. The entire room had already turned against him, not because Bennett wore a robe, but because everyone had heard what came before it. Less than 20 minutes earlier, the same courthouse had looked ordinary beneath a cold Baltimore rain. Water traced narrow lines down the tall windows while morning traffic hissed across the wet streets outside. Inside, security scanners hummed near the entrance, attorneys carried thick folders under their arms, and families waited on wooden benches beneath lights that made every face look tired. Isaiah Bennett entered through the public doors wearing a charcoal suit, a navy tie, and a dark overcoat dotted with rain. There was no driver behind him, no escort beside him, and no robe to announce his position. He had spent most of the night at a hospital 2 miles away, sitting beside his mother after a brief medical emergency. Rather than return home, he had gone directly to the courthouse with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and an old leather briefcase in the other. Inside that briefcase was a sealed federal file containing statements from Black residents who claimed a former city officer had repeatedly ignored identification, dismissed explanations, and treated suspicion as proof. Bennett had read every page before sunrise. One name appeared more than once: Ryan Caldwell. Near the restricted entrance to the judicial chambers, Bennett reached into his coat for his key card. Before he could remove it, a voice stopped him. "That hallway is not for the public." Bennett turned. Caldwell stood about 10 feet away in a courthouse security uniform, one hand near his radio, and certainty already settled across his face. Bennett gave him a calm nod. "I am aware." Caldwell stepped closer. "Then you need to move." Bennett studied the nameplate above the officer's credential. Ryan Caldwell, the same name in the file. For one brief second, recognition passed through Bennett's eyes. Then he removed his federal identification and held it out. "You may verify this with the clerk's office." Caldwell barely looked at the card before handing it back. "I have seen fake credentials before." Bennett placed the identification carefully into his pocket. "Then follow the verification procedure." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "You do not give instructions here." Bennett remained still as the rain tapped against the windows. "Then I suggest you contact someone who does." Caldwell did not reach for his radio. Instead, he looked at Bennett as though the request itself were an insult. The officer had been given a name, a federal identification card, and a clear procedure to follow, yet he seemed more interested in protecting his first assumption than discovering the truth. "I decide when verification is necessary," he said. Bennett held his gaze. "That is not how federal security works." A few feet away, Court Clerk Emily Parker emerged from the records office carrying 2 folders against her chest. She recognized Bennett immediately and slowed when she saw Caldwell, blocking the entrance to chambers. "Good morning, Judge Bennett," she began, but Caldwell raised one hand before she could finish. "Stay back, ma'am. I am handling a security issue." Emily looked from the officer to Bennett. "There is no security issue. He has authorized access." Caldwell turned toward her, irritation replacing caution. "Did you personally inspect his identification?" "I do not need to. I know him." "That is not an answer." Bennett noticed the change in Caldwell's tone. It was the same pattern described in the sealed statements inside his briefcase. Questions were not being asked to gather information. They were being used to dismiss it. Emily stepped closer. Officer Caldwell, contact Chief Deputy Morgan. He will confirm everything. Caldwell gave a short laugh. I am not calling a chief deputy every time someone claims to belong behind a restricted door. Bennett reached slowly into his coat and removed his key card. The gold federal seal caught the white hallway light. Then watch carefully, he said. He placed the card against the electronic reader beside the chamber's entrance. A green light appeared, followed by the quiet click of the lock releasing. Emily exhaled, certain the matter had ended. It had not. Caldwell moved between Bennett and the open doorway. That card could have been stolen. The words left the hallway colder than the rain outside. Two attorneys walking toward Courtroom 4 stopped near the elevators. A court reporter lowered her coffee cup. The people nearby did not yet know Bennett's title, but they understood what they had just witnessed. Proof had been offered. Caldwell had rejected it because accepting it would require admitting that his judgment had been wrong. Bennett slipped the key card back into his pocket. You have now refused 3 forms of verification, he said. My identification, the clerk's confirmation, and authorized electronic access. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Do not lecture me about my job. I am describing your choices. The officer glanced toward the growing audience, and embarrassment sharpened his expression. He reached for the radio at last, but his report did not mention the working key card or Emily's confirmation. I have a suspicious individual attempting to enter judicial chambers with questionable credentials, he said. Bennett listened without interrupting. Every missing detail mattered. Every carefully chosen word shaped a version of events designed to justify a conclusion Caldwell had reached before speaking to him. When the transmission ended, Bennett lifted the leather briefcase slightly. This contains sealed court material. You are not authorized to open or remove it. Caldwell looked at the case and then back at him. Set it down. No, the answer was quiet. Immediate. Caldwell stepped closer, lowering his voice. You people walk into places like this and think the rules do not apply to you. Emily's face went still. One attorney near the elevator opened a notebook. Bennett felt the weight of the sealed complaints in his hand and understood that the hearing had already begun, not at the scheduled hour and not from the bench, but here in the hallway, where a man with authority believed no one important was watching. Officer Caldwell, Bennett said, you should think carefully about what you say next. Caldwell heard the warning, but he did not hear the opportunity inside it. Bennett was not threatening him. He was offering one final chance to return to procedure before pride carried the moment beyond repair. Yet Caldwell looked toward the attorneys, the court reporter, and the clerk, and saw only witnesses to a challenge he believed he had to win. I know exactly what I am saying, he replied. His voice rose just enough to reach the open doors of Courtroom 4. You are refusing a lawful security instruction. Bennett remained calm. State the instruction and the rules supporting it. Caldwell paused. The question was simple. That made it dangerous. He had no rule to cite because Bennett had shown valid identification, demonstrated authorized access, and received confirmation from a court employee. What remained was not security. It was Caldwell's need to prove that his first judgment could not be questioned. The rule is that you follow directions when an officer gives them, he said. One of the attorneys near the elevator stopped, writing, and looked up. Emily Parker tightened her grip on the folders. Bennett studied Caldwell with the patience of a judge listening to testimony that revealed more than the speaker intended. Authority is not a rule, Bennett said. It is a responsibility. Caldwell's expression hardened. Do not try to impress me with speeches. I am asking you to explain your actions. I do not answer to you. The words echoed beneath the high ceiling. For a moment, no one moved. Imagine standing in a federal courthouse with proof in your pocket, access at your fingertips, and a clerk ready to confirm your identity, only to realize that none of it matters to a man who has already decided what your face means. Bennett had read that experience in complaint after complaint. A driver who presented a valid registration and was still treated as suspicious. A teacher whose employee badge was dismissed without inspection. A college student whose explanation was described as attitude. Their words had been reduced to summaries, then closed for lack of corroboration. Now Bennett understood the pattern not as language on a page, but as something living in the space between Caldwell's certainty and the truth. Emily stepped forward again. Officer Caldwell, Judge Bennett is scheduled in Courtroom 4 at 10 o'clock. Caldwell turned toward her before she could continue. I told you to stay out of this. The title had been spoken, but he rejected it as quickly as every other fact. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked. Emily stared at him. "You could confirm it in less than 30 seconds. Caldwell pointed toward the courtroom doors. "He can wait inside until support arrives." Bennett glanced at the clock above the entrance. 9:46. 14 minutes remained before the scheduled hearing. "We're inside," he asked. Caldwell motioned toward the rear section near the defense tables. "There." The attorneys exchanged looks. The court reporter set down her coffee. Emily's face lost its uncertainty and became firm. "That area is reserved for defendants and counsel." Caldwell did not look at her. "Then he should have no problem waiting there." Bennett held Caldwell's gaze. "You have been given my identification, my access card, the clerk's confirmation, and my name. What exactly are you still investigating?" Caldwell stepped aside and pointed into the courtroom. "Whether you understand that people like you do not decide where they belong." The hallway went silent. Not cautious silence. Not confused silence. This was the silence that follows a line everyone recognizes should never have been crossed. Bennett looked toward the empty judicial bench, then back at Caldwell. "People like me?" he asked. Caldwell's confidence returned when he mistook restraint for surrender. "You heard me." Bennett lifted his briefcase and walked toward courtroom 4. The people watching moved aside, but their eyes remained on Caldwell. The officer followed, believing he had taken control. He did not realize the courtroom was already beginning to turn against him. Inside courtroom 4, the air carried the quiet tension of a room waiting for judgment. Attorneys stood beside organized stacks of exhibits. Reporters occupied the rear benches with notebooks open. A few families sat together beneath the federal seal, their faces marked by the long patience of people who had learned that justice often moved more slowly than pain. Bennett entered without speaking and walked toward the section Caldwell had indicated. Every step seemed louder than it should have been. Caldwell followed several feet behind, his expression fixed with the satisfaction of a man who believed obedience had confirmed his authority. "Sit there," he said, pointing toward a seat near the defense tables. Bennett placed his leather briefcase beside the chair but remained standing. "Before I sit, answer one question." Caldwell folded his arms. "You are not in a position to question me. Where exactly do you believe my place is?" The words moved across the courtroom and drew every eye toward them. Caldwell glanced around at the gathering audience, then pointed again. "Right there, until someone proves you belong somewhere else." No one laughed. The silence was immediate and complete. Emily Parker entered through the courtroom doors and stopped near the clerk's desk. "Officer Caldwell, this has gone far enough." He turned toward her. "Return to your station." "My station is here." Her voice was steady now. "And I am telling you that this man belongs in this courtroom." Caldwell looked toward the attorneys as if expecting support. Instead, one of them closed his case file and stepped into the aisle. He was a middle-aged public defender named Samuel Price, known for speaking carefully and only when necessary. "Officer," Samuel said, "you have been offered multiple forms of identification. What legal basis do you have for continuing this?" Caldwell's face tightened. "This is a security matter." "Then follow the security procedure." Another voice came from the gallery. An older black veteran named Walter Green rose slowly with the help of his cane. "A procedure is supposed to protect everyone," he said. "Not just the people you already trust." Caldwell looked toward him. "Sir, sit down." Walter remained standing. "I served this country for 24 years. I know the difference between order and disrespect." A murmur passed through the gallery. Bennett watched the room carefully. The people around him still did not know his title, but they no longer needed it. They had seen the identification dismissed. They had watched the working key card ignored. They had heard Emily's confirmation rejected and the phrase "people like you" spoken without shame. The courtroom was not turning because Bennett held hidden authority. It was turning because Caldwell's conduct had become impossible to defend. Emily moved to the clerk's desk and opened the official log. "The time is 9:49, she said clearly. "I am recording that Officer Ryan Caldwell has refused to verify federal credentials and has directed an authorized court official to the defense section." Caldwell stared at her. "Do not put that in the record." Emily looked up. "You do not control the record." The sentence landed with a force no raised voice could have matched. Samuel took out a pen and began writing down every exchange. A court reporter opened her stenography machine. Walter remained standing beside the gallery rail. One by one, the witnesses stopped being spectators. Caldwell saw the change and mistook it for rebellion. Everyone needs to sit down and stop interfering, he ordered. No one moved. Bennett finally lowered himself into the chair, not because Caldwell had earned compliance, but because the truth was now gathering around him. He rested one hand on the briefcase and looked toward the empty bench. "Officer Caldwell," he said, "you wanted to decide where I belonged before you knew anything about me." Caldwell stepped closer. "I know enough." Bennett turned his gaze back to him. "That is the problem." The room held Caldwell's silence for several seconds, and in that silence his certainty began to look less like authority and more like fear of being corrected. Bennett remained seated near the defense tables, one hand resting on the worn leather briefcase, while Emily Parker continued entering the exchange into the official log. Samuel Price stood in the aisle with his notes. Walter Green leaned on his cane, watching with the steady patience of a man who had seen uniforms used well and poorly. Caldwell looked from one face to another and realized that the courtroom was no longer waiting for him to explain. It was waiting for him to stop. "This is still a security matter," he said, but the words had lost their force. Samuel answered carefully. "Then provide the security reason." Caldwell ignored him and turned toward Bennett. "Open the case." Bennett's expression did not change. "No, you are refusing an officer's order. I am protecting sealed federal material." Caldwell stepped closer to the table. "You have not proven that anything in there is federal." Bennett looked down at the briefcase, then back at him. "You have refused every opportunity to verify it." Emily spoke from the clerk's desk. "The court seal is visible on the exterior tag." Caldwell glanced at the small brass plate attached near the handle. The words United States District Court were clearly engraved beneath Bennett's full name. For a brief moment, his eyes stopped moving. The evidence was no longer subtle. It was in front of him, readable from several feet away. Yet accepting it would mean admitting that everything he had done since the hallway had been based on a judgment he never had the right to make. "Tags can be copied," he said. The court reporter looked up from her machine. Walter shook his head slowly. Samuel closed his notebook. The reaction in the room was not outrage now. It was disbelief. Bennett understood that the moment had crossed an invisible line. Caldwell was no longer mistaken. He was choosing the mistake because it protected his pride. "Officer Caldwell," Bennett said, "what evidence would you accept?" Caldwell opened his mouth, but no answer came. Bennett continued. "My identification was not enough. My access card was not enough. The clerk's confirmation was not enough. The court seal is not enough. So tell this room what would be enough." Caldwell's face tightened. "Someone with real authority." Emily looked toward the clock. 9:53. 7 minutes remained before the scheduled hearing. Bennett followed her gaze, then looked toward the closed door beside the bench that led to chambers. "You have already spoken to someone with authority," he said. Caldwell gave a short, dismissive laugh. "You expect everyone here to believe that?" Walter answered before Bennett could. "I believe what I saw." Samuel nodded. "So do I." The court reporter said nothing, but her hands remained ready above the keys. Emily closed the log and stood. "Officer Caldwell, Chief Deputy United States Marshal David Morgan is scheduled to enter this courtroom before 10 o'clock. When he arrives, he will confirm Judge Bennett's identity." The title was finally spoken in full. Several people in the gallery turned toward Bennett. Caldwell stared at Emily, then at the man he had directed to the defense section. His expression shifted, but only slightly. Doubt appeared. Pride pushed it back down. "You are all trying to protect him," he said. Bennett rose from the chair with deliberate calm. "No, Officer Caldwell. They are protecting the truth." At that moment, the side door near the bench opened, and the measured footsteps of Chief Deputy United States Marshal David Morgan entered the courtroom. David Morgan stopped just inside the side entrance, and the room seemed to recognize his authority before he spoke. He wore a dark suit beneath the identification of the United States Marshal Service, and two deputies remained several steps behind him near the chamber's door. His eyes moved first to Emily Parker at the clerk's desk, then to Samuel Price in the aisle, then to Walter Green beside the gallery rail. Finally, he saw Isaiah Bennett standing near the defense tables with his briefcase at his side. Morgan's expression changed immediately. "Judge Bennett," he said, "why are you standing there?" The question traveled across the courtroom and erased the last trace of confidence from Caldwell's face. No one whispered. No one needed an explanation. The title had now been spoken by the highest-ranking security official in the room. Caldwell looked toward Bennett, then toward Morgan, as though the facts might change if he delayed accepting them. "Chief Deputy Morgan," he said, "I was responding to a possible breach of the restricted chambers area." Morgan turned to him slowly. "A breach involving the judge assigned to this courtroom?" Caldwell's voice weakened. His identification appeared questionable. Emily answered from the clerk's desk. It was valid. His key card opened chambers. I confirmed his access more than once. Morgan looked toward Samuel. "Did you witness that?" "Yes," Samuel replied. Officer Caldwell refused every form of verification offered to him. Walter raised one hand slightly. He also directed Judge Bennett to sit near the defense tables after being told who he was. Morgan's gaze returned to Caldwell. "Did you contact the Marshal's service for confirmation?" Caldwell hesitated. "I reported a suspicious person. That was not my question." The silence that followed was brief, but complete. "No," Caldwell admitted. Morgan looked toward the security camera above the rear doors. "Is the system active?" Emily nodded. "The hallway and courtroom feeds are both recording." Morgan instructed one deputy to preserve the footage, radio traffic, access log, and security records from the past 20 minutes. The deputy moved toward the clerk's station without delay. Caldwell watched each instruction as if the room were closing around the version of events he had tried to create. Bennett said nothing. He had spent the morning offering facts. Now the facts were speaking without him. Morgan stepped closer to Caldwell. "Move away from Judge Bennett and remain near the rear wall until further instruction." Caldwell obeyed. It was the first clear direction he had followed all morning. Bennett picked up his briefcase and walked toward the side entrance. The same courtroom that had watched him placed near the defense tables now watched him cross toward chambers with no announcement, no display, and no need to prove anything further. Emily disappeared through the side door and returned moments later carrying a neatly pressed black judicial robe. Bennett removed his overcoat and accepted the robe from her. The gesture was simple, almost ceremonial, but the meaning was impossible to miss. He had deserved respect before the robe touched his shoulders. The fabric only made visible the authority Caldwell had refused to recognize in a black man wearing an ordinary suit. Bennett entered chambers. Morgan took his place near the bench and looked across the courtroom. "All rise." The words moved through the room like a current. Attorneys stood. Reporters stood. Walter pushed himself upright with his cane. Emily rose beside the clerk's desk. Caldwell stood near the rear wall, his face pale beneath the bright courtroom lights. The side door opened again. "The United States District Court for the District of Maryland is now in session," Emily announced. "The Honorable Judge Isaiah Bennett presiding." Bennett stepped into the courtroom wearing the black robe and walked toward the bench. Every eye followed him. He took his seat beneath the federal seal, arranged the sealed folder before him, and looked directly at Caldwell. "Be seated," he said. The courtroom sat as one. Caldwell remained standing because he no longer knew where he was permitted to belong. Bennett let the silence settle before speaking again. "Officer Caldwell, a misunderstanding ends when the truth is offered," he said. "You were offered the truth repeatedly. You chose not to accept it." Caldwell remained near the rear wall while everyone else sat, his hands held stiffly at his sides and his eyes fixed on the security credential clipped to his uniform. Minutes earlier, that credential had seemed to him like unquestionable proof that his judgment carried more weight than anyone else's explanation. Now it looked different beneath the courtroom lights. It looked temporary. Bennett opened the sealed folder but did not read from it. Instead, he looked toward David Morgan. "Chief Deputy Morgan, please ensure that every recording connected to this incident is preserved without alteration." Morgan nodded. "The hallway footage, courtroom footage, radio traffic, and access records are already being secured, Your Honor." Bennett turned to Emily Parker. "Enter the names of all witnesses who observed the exchange." Emily opened the official log. Samuel Price gave his full name and contact information. Walter Green did the same. The court reporter identified herself, followed by 2 attorneys and 3 members of the public who had been present near the chamber's entrance. One by one, people who had once stood in silence became part of a record that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding. Caldwell watched them speak and seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that authority did not control truth once enough people were willing to tell it. "Your Honor," he said, I made a difficult judgment call. Bennett's voice remained calm. A judgment call requires facts. You rejected the facts that were offered. Caldwell looked toward Morgan. I believed the courthouse was at risk. Then you should have followed the established verification process, Morgan replied. You did not. Bennett rested one hand on the unopened file. There is another matter this court must address. The room became still again. This folder contains material that was scheduled for review today. Officer Caldwell, your name appears in several complaint summaries connected to earlier incidents during your service with the Baltimore Police Department. Caldwell's face changed. Those complaints were closed. They were closed because investigators reported insufficient corroboration, Bennett said. This morning's events may be relevant to that conclusion. A murmur moved through the gallery, but Bennett lifted one hand, and the room returned to silence. He did not open the file further. He did not reveal private details. Because I am now a direct witness to conduct that may overlap with those allegations, I cannot preside over the scheduled matter or make any decision concerning you. Caldwell looked confused. He had expected punishment from the bench, perhaps even public humiliation. Instead, Bennett was stepping away from the power to judge him. I will recuse myself, Bennett continued. The case will be reassigned to an independent federal judge. The evidence from this morning will be transferred without commentary from me. Samuel Price lowered his pen. Walter Green looked toward Bennett with quiet respect. The difference between the two men had become unmistakable. Caldwell had used authority to avoid scrutiny. Bennett was limiting his own authority to protect fairness. Morgan stepped toward Caldwell. Pending independent review, surrender your courthouse credential and radio. Caldwell stared at him. Chief Deputy, is that necessary? Morgan's expression did not change. Yes. The courtroom waited. Slowly, Caldwell removed the credential from his uniform. The plastic card caught the light as he placed it into Morgan's open hand. Then he handed over the radio that had carried his incomplete version of events through the building. Bennett watched without satisfaction. This was not a victory over one man. It was the beginning of a process that had failed too many others. Officer Caldwell, he said, your greatest mistake was not that you failed to recognize a judge. It was that you believed respect should depend on recognizing one. Caldwell lowered his eyes. Bennett looked toward the families seated in the gallery, then toward the sealed names inside the folder. The law cannot protect only those who arrive with titles, robes, or witnesses, he said. If it does, it is not justice. It is privilege wearing the language of justice. The credential rested in Morgan's hand while the courtroom absorbed Bennett's words. No one celebrated. There was no applause, no satisfaction, and no sense that the morning had produced a simple winner and loser. What had happened was larger than embarrassment. It had exposed a pattern that could no longer remain hidden behind closed reports and incomplete reviews. Bennett looked toward Rachel Monroe, the assistant United States attorney who had entered quietly during the final exchange and now stood near the government table with a blue file box at her side. Ms. Monroe, he said, you were scheduled to present preliminary materials this morning. Because I have recused myself, do not address the substance of those allegations before me. However, confirm whether additional complainants have requested independent review. Rachel opened the file box without removing any sealed documents. Yes, Your Honor. 7 individuals have renewed their requests, and 3 more contacted our office after receiving notice of today's hearing. Caldwell lifted his eyes. 10 people. Rachel looked toward him but answered the court. 10 known requests. There may be others. The number settled over the room with quiet force. Caldwell had treated each earlier complaint as an isolated accusation, something that could be explained away by uncertainty, confusion, or missing evidence. 10 voices made that explanation harder to maintain. 10 voices suggested repetition. Bennett turned to Morgan. Transfer the preserved recordings and access logs directly to the assigned investigator. No internal editing, summaries, or informal review before the originals are secured. Understood, Morgan said. Bennett then addressed Emily. Notify the chief judge that this matter requires immediate reassignment. Include my written recusal and nothing beyond the factual sequence recorded this morning. Emily nodded and began preparing the notice. The discipline of the process mattered. Bennett would not contaminate the review with anger, even though every person in the room understood he had reason to feel it. Caldwell looked toward the bench. Judge Bennett, I did not know those complaints were connected to the hearing. Bennett held his gaze. You did not need to know. Caldwell seemed confused. Your conduct should not depend on whether your past is being reviewed. The answer left him with nowhere to hide. Rachel placed one hand on the blue file box. The prior complaints described the same refusal to verify documents, the same incomplete radio reports, and the same language suggesting that certain people did not belong in certain places. Caldwell's face tightened. Those are allegations. Yes, Rachel said, and they will now be examined with evidence. Walter Green lowered himself into his seat. Samuel Price returned to the counsel table but kept his notebook open. The court reporter continued recording every word. Around them, the courthouse resumed its quiet rhythm. Yet Courtroom 4 remained suspended inside a moment that would follow everyone beyond that morning. Bennett removed his glasses and folded them beside the sealed file. This court will not decide your future today, Officer Caldwell, he said. An independent process will do that. But this court will make certain that every person who came forward is finally heard. Morgan directed one deputy to accompany Caldwell from the courtroom while the administrative review began. Caldwell took one step, then stopped. Your Honor, he said quietly, are you doing all of this because of what happened to you? Bennett looked toward the gallery, where families waited beside folders containing names that had once been easy to ignore. No, he answered. I am doing it because what happened to me was witnessed, recorded, and believed. They deserve the same. Caldwell lowered his head and continued toward the rear doors. As they closed behind him, Bennett looked down at the empty space where the credential had once rested against Caldwell's uniform. The badge had not created the prejudice. It had only given that prejudice room to act. Now the truth had entered the same room, and unlike authority, truth did not need permission to remain. 4 months later, Courtroom 4 looked almost exactly as it had on that rainy morning, but the people inside it carried a different understanding of what the room represented. The same federal seal hung above the bench. The same wooden gallery seats faced forward beneath the bright lights. Yet this time, Isaiah Bennett did not enter through the chamber's door. He walked through the public entrance wearing a dark suit and took a seat in the second row beside Emily Parker, Walter Green, Samuel Price, and several families whose complaints had once been closed without full review. He was not there as the presiding judge. He was there as a witness to a process that no longer depended on his title. The investigation had examined courthouse footage, radio transmissions, access logs, prior reports, and statements from more than a dozen people. 3 official findings had been revised to reflect evidence that had been omitted. 2 pending cases connected to Caldwell's earlier police work had been dismissed after independent reviewers found serious procedural failures. His courthouse clearance had been permanently revoked, and his employer had accepted his resignation from federal security service. More important, every complaint linked to his conduct was now being reviewed by people outside the chain of command that had once dismissed them. Rachel Monroe stood at the government table with the final summary before her. David Morgan remained near the side wall, no longer carrying the tension of uncertainty, only the responsibility of seeing the process completed. Then the rear doors opened. Ryan Caldwell entered without a uniform, without a radio, and without the credential that had once made him believe his judgment could not be questioned. He wore a plain gray suit and walked beside his attorney toward the front table. His eyes moved toward the bench first, then toward Bennett in the gallery. For a moment, the 2 men looked at each other across the room. Bennett did not smile. There was no triumph in his expression. He had not come to watch Caldwell lose something. He had come to see whether the people Caldwell had ignored would finally be treated as credible. The clerk rose. All rise. Every person in the courtroom stood. Bennett stood with them. Emily stood. Walter pushed himself upright with his cane. The family stood beside folders containing names that had once existed only in forgotten files. Caldwell stood as well, but now the command did not come from him. It came from an institution that demanded equal respect and owed equal protection in return. The newly assigned federal judge entered and took the bench. After reviewing the independent findings, she confirmed that Caldwell's courthouse access would remain revoked and referred the remaining matters to the appropriate state authorities and licensing bodies. She also ordered continuing review of all cases in which his conduct had been formally questioned. The decision did not erase the past. It created a path for the truth to keep moving. When the proceeding ended, people slowly gathered their belongings. Caldwell remained near the aisle while Bennett rose from the gallery. "Judge Bennett," Caldwell said quietly. Bennett stopped. Caldwell struggled for several seconds before continuing. "I judged you before I knew who you were." Bennett held his gaze. "You knew enough to treat me like a human being." Caldwell lowered his eyes. There was no argument left, no uniform to hide behind, and no version of events that could silence the record. Bennett turned and walked toward the doors with the families beside him. Behind them, the courtroom remained quiet beneath the federal seal. Caldwell had once believed power meant deciding where other people belonged. In the end, the law taught him that dignity has no assigned seat, and justice begins when authority remembers its limits.